Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Manga Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. The night air was still and suffocating, broken only by the soft hum of Ben's truck engine as he pulled into the driveway. The day had been long, the overtime shift brutal. But it was all worth it, he reminded himself, if it meant providing for Emma and their modest suburban life. Yet tonight something gnawed at him, a disquiet he couldn't quite name. As Ben stepped into the house, he noticed the faint glow of Emma's phone on the kitchen counter. She was a creature of habit, always diligent about putting her devices on silent during the night. The sight of it lit up and unlocked was strange. Then, something stranger caught his eye, a message notification from a name he didn't recognize, Ryan. Curiosity got the better of him. He glanced at the screen, his heart already racing. The text read, "Can't wait to see you again tomorrow. Same time?" A tightness clutched his chest. His hands felt clammy as he swiped to read more, scrolling through an intimate exchange that left no room for doubt. The words were laced with affection, longing, and a familiarity that Emma never showed him anymore. Ben sank into one of the kitchen chairs, his body leaden with betrayal. He replayed moments in his mind, her sudden girls' nights out, the evasive glances, and the phone call she ended abruptly when he entered the room. It all made sense now, and yet, the enormity of it was crushing. He stared at her phone until the screen dimmed and then turned dark. His resolve hardened. This wasn't the time to confront her, not yet. He needed clarity, proof, something irrefutable, not just for himself, but for the family who had always believed in their love story. Ben didn't sleep that night. Instead, he quietly began planning. He would follow her. He'd get the truth in a way that couldn't be twisted or denied. By morning, his anguish had cooled into a determined calm. It was time to see the woman he loved for who she really was, no matter how much it would hurt. Build up for the next part. This opening sets the tone of betrayal and unravels the early emotional devastation Ben experiences. His discovery pushes him onto a path of methodical planning, rather than impulsive confrontation, which aligns with his character as a man of integrity who values control and evidence over blind rage. Would you like to expand on his inner turmoil or Emma's behaviors leading up to this point? Or should we dive into the dramatic turning point when Ben gathers his evidence? The next evening, Ben's truck rolled to a quiet stop a block away from his home. From here, he had a perfect view of his own driveway, the faint glow of the porch light illuminating the facade he had worked so hard to maintain. It felt surreal, almost laughable, that this was the same house where he had poured so much love and labor. And now, here he was, waiting for proof of his wife's betrayal. Ben shifted in his seat, the leather creaking beneath him. The faint scent of engine oil clung to his hands, a reminder of the long hours he'd put in that day. Yet his exhaustion was nowhere to be found. His adrenaline masked it, fueling his focus. He had tracked Emma's behavior for weeks, noting the nights when her errands stretched too long or her phone pinged incessantly with messages she refused to share. Then, it happened. Emma emerged from the house, dressed in a way that made Ben's stomach tighten. It wasn't her usual attire. This was carefully curated, a fitted blouse, high heels, and the faintest touch of makeup. Not enough to raise eyebrows, but just enough to send a message to someone. She slid into her car, her phone clutched in her hand, the screen lighting up her features in the darkness. Ben didn't follow immediately. He waited for her car to round the corner, giving her enough of a head start before he eased his truck into gear. The tires crunched softly against the gravel, the hum of the engine low, like a predator stalking its prey. Ben's heart raced as he trailed her at a careful distance. The streets were quiet, the occasional streetlight casting pools of pale light. His grip on the steering wheel tightened when she pulled into the lot of a dimly lit cafe on the outskirts of town, a spot he'd never known her to frequent. He parked across the street, his eyes fixed on her as she stepped out of the car, scanned the area, and walked inside. Minutes later, a man joined her. Ben recognized him instantly. Ryan was younger, fit, and confident in a way that grated on Ben's nerves. The way Ryan smiled at Emma, leaned in as if the world around them didn't exist, made Ben's skin crawl. He watched as they spoke, their hands brushing briefly across the table, an intimacy so casual it felt rehearsed. Ben's mind churned as he sat in the shadows, his truck becoming an extension of his presence, a silent witness. Every smile they exchanged, every touch, deepened his resolve. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a fleeting lapse in judgment. This was a relationship, a calculated betrayal built on stolen hours and whispered lies. Still, he didn't storm in. He couldn't. This wasn't just about catching her red-handed, it was about ensuring the truth couldn't be denied. So he raised his phone, his hand steady despite the storm inside him, and began to record. Through the grainy lens, he captured their laughter, the way Emma's eyes sparkled with a happiness she hadn't shown him in years. His mind replayed her promises, the vows they exchanged, and the mornings they spent dreaming of a future he now realized was a lie. Each second of footage burned into his memory, branding him with the reality he could no longer ignore. An hour later, Emma and Ryan left the cafe. Ben followed them to a quiet residential area where Ryan parked in front of a small house. Emma hesitated for a moment before following him inside. The door clicked shut, leaving Ben alone in the dark, staring at the closed curtains of the home that now concealed the ultimate betrayal. Ben didn't move for a long time. He sat there, the truck idling softly, his thoughts louder than any sound around him. He had the evidence now, proof not just for himself but for those who believed in the facade of his marriage. Yet, instead of anger, he felt an unsettling calm. He knew what he had to do, and it would start with a single, devastating act of truth. Next steps. This expansion avoids repetition by adding rich descriptions of Ben's emotions, the detailed movements of Emma and Ryan, and the methodical way Ben gathers evidence. Would you like to focus on Emma's reaction when Ben ultimately reveals the proof, or should we delve deeper into Ben's emotional state as he prepares for the fallout? The morning dawned cold and gray, mirroring the storm brewing in Ben's heart. He sat in the living room, his laptop open on the coffee table. The files were ready, clear, undeniable proof of Emma's affair. He had spent hours the previous night editing the footage, ensuring every angle, every damning glance and touch was preserved. This wasn't just evidence for him, it was the unvarnished truth that Emma's family deserved to see. The house was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Emma was still asleep upstairs, oblivious to the revelations Ben had uncovered. He glanced at his phone and saw Sarah's text, a simple message from his sister checking in. She'd sensed something was wrong in his voice the last time they spoke, but Ben had brushed it off. Now, he typed out a short reply, "I need you later. It's important." For hours, he moved through the motions of a normal morning. He brewed coffee, prepared breakfast, and left Emma's plate untouched on the counter when she failed to appear. It wasn't until mid-morning that she descended the stairs, dressed in leggings and an oversized sweater, her hair in a messy bun. She greeted him with a kiss on the cheek, the gesture almost cruel in its normalcy. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, her voice light. Ben forced a smile. "Yeah, long night though." Emma poured herself a cup of coffee, oblivious to the sharpness in his tone. As she settled into a chair across from him, she pulled out her phone and began scrolling, her face a mask of calm. For a moment, Ben envied her ignorance, the blissful bubble she had created while he carried the weight of her betrayal. It was Sarah's arrival that broke the fragile morning routine. She walked in without knocking, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. Emma looked up, surprised. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" Sarah hesitated, glancing at Ben, who gave her a small nod. "Ben called me. Said there was something we all needed to talk about." Emma frowned, setting down her coffee. "What's going on? Is everything okay?" Ben leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. His piercing green eyes met hers, and she faltered under the weight of his gaze. "No, Emma," he said, his voice steady. "Everything's not okay. Not even close." The room grew tense as Emma shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Sarah watched in silence, her eyes darting between her brother and Emma. "What are you talking about?" Emma's voice carried an edge of defensiveness, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "If this is about last night's dinner, This isn't about dinner," Ben interrupted, his voice cutting through her excuses. "It's about you and Ryan." Emma froze. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second before narrowing, her lips pressing into a thin line. "What do you mean?" she asked, but her voice lacked conviction. Ben reached for his laptop and turned it toward her. With a single click, the video began to play. The cafe came into view, and then there they were, Emma and Ryan, leaning across the table, their smiles intimate and unmistakable. The room was filled with the sound of their laughter, faint but clear enough to convey their closeness. Emma's face drained of color. "Ben," she began, her voice trembling. "I can explain." "Explain what?" Ben demanded, his voice rising for the first time. "Explain how you've been sneaking around behind my back. How you've been lying to me, to your family." "Go ahead, Emma. I'd love to hear your explanation." Tears welled in her eyes, but Ben's anger left no room for pity. Sarah's jaw tightened as she watched her sister-in-law struggle to speak, her earlier suspicion hardening into certainty. Ben, it's not what it looks like, Emma pleaded, her voice breaking. I was lonely, and it just happened. But it didn't mean anything. Didn't mean anything. Ben repeated, his voice low and icy. You threw away 14 years of marriage, of trust, for someone who didn't mean anything. Emma's tears spilled over, and she buried her face in her hands. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice muffled. I didn't mean to hurt you. You didn't mean to hurt me. Ben shot back, standing abruptly. Every time you met him, every lie you told, you made a choice. You knew exactly what you were doing. Sarah stood, her arms crossed. How could you, Emma? How could you betray him like this? He's given you everything. Emma looked up, her eyes red and swollen. I didn't know how to stop. I was afraid if I told him, he'd leave me. Well, congratulations, Ben said coldly. You were right about one thing. I am leaving. Emma's sobs filled the room, but Ben felt nothing but a hollow ache. He had loved her, trusted her, and now all that was left was a shell of what once was. He turned to Sarah. I need you to help me pack. Of course, Sarah said, her voice firm. As Ben left the room, Emma's cries followed him. But he didn't look back. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of clarity. The truth was out, and now he could finally begin to rebuild. The morning after the confrontation, Ben woke in the spare room at Sarah's house. The exhaustion from the previous night lingered, but there was an eerie calm in its wake. For the first time in weeks, he felt a strange clarity. His actions were no longer driven by confusion or anger. The truth was out, and now he had to ensure it reached those who needed to know. Ben sat at Sarah's kitchen table, his coffee untouched. His sister moved quietly around the kitchen, giving him the space to gather his thoughts. The weight of his plan settled heavily on his shoulders. He had no intention of revenge, not the kind that destroyed for destruction's sake, but he needed Emma to face the consequences of her actions, especially with her family, who had always regarded their marriage as a foundation of stability. Are you ready for this? Sarah asked softly, breaking the silence. Ben nodded, his jaw set. They need to know. They deserve the truth. Sarah hesitated before speaking again. Are you sure you don't want to handle this privately? You've already confronted her. Maybe it's enough. It's not just about me, Ben replied, his voice steady. She built this facade for years, convincing everyone we had the perfect marriage, while she lied to all of us. If I let her continue pretending, she'll never understand the damage she's caused. That afternoon, Ben drove to Emma's parents' home. Susan and David had always been supportive, treating him like a son. Their admiration for the way he provided for Emma and worked tirelessly to give them both a good life had been unwavering. As he parked in their driveway, his resolve wavered for a brief moment. But then he remembered the betrayal, the nights spent alone, while Emma lived a double life. He couldn't stay silent. The door opened before he even reached it. Susan greeted him with a warm smile that quickly faded when she saw the tension in his expression. Ben, what's wrong? She asked, stepping aside to let him in. David appeared in the hallway, his brows furrowed. What's going on? Where's Emma? Ben hesitated, his voice catching. We need to talk. It's about Emma and Ryan. Susan's face paled. Ryan? What does he have to do with this? Taking a deep breath, Ben pulled out his laptop and placed it on the coffee table. I found out that Emma has been seeing him, behind my back, for months, maybe longer. David sat heavily in the armchair, his hands gripping the armrests. Susan's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. No, she whispered. Not Emma, she wouldn't. Ben opened the video files he had recorded and turned the screen toward them. As the footage played, Susan sobbed quietly, and David's expression hardened into one of anger and disbelief. The sound of Emma's laughter, so carefree and intimate, felt like a dagger twisting in the room. When the video ended, David stood abruptly, pacing the room. How could she do this? To you, to us. We raised her better than this. Susan wept openly now, her hands trembling. I thought she was happy, Ben. I thought you both were. We were, Ben said, his voice tinged with sadness. At least, I thought we were. But somewhere along the way, she made a different choice. David turned to him, his anger now tempered with regret. I'm so sorry, Ben. You didn't deserve this. None of us did. Ben nodded, his throat tightening. I'm not here for sympathy. I'm here because you needed to know. She's your daughter, and what happens next is up to you. But I won't keep her secrets for her anymore. The fallout began almost immediately. Susan called Emma, her voice shaking with a mixture of fury and heartbreak. Emma arrived within the hour, her face streaked with tears, pleading with her parents to listen. Ben stayed only long enough to hear the beginnings of the confrontation before slipping out quietly. This wasn't his battle to fight anymore. He had done his part. As he drove back to Sarah's house, his phone buzzed. A text from Susan read, "Thank you for telling us. We'll handle it from here." Another followed soon after from Emma's younger brother Tom. "I had no idea. I'm so sorry, Ben. If you need anything, I'm here." Despite the whirlwind of emotions, Ben felt lighter. The truth had begun to spread, unraveling the lies that had held their lives together. Emma's betrayal wasn't just his burden now. It belonged to everyone she had deceived. That evening, Ben sat on Sarah's porch, staring out at the darkening sky. His sister joined him, handing him a beer. "How'd it go?" she asked. As expected, Ben replied. "They're heartbroken. Angry, but they needed to know." Sarah nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "You did the right thing, Ben. Hiding it would have only protected her lies." Ben took a sip of his beer, the bitterness a strange comfort. "It's not about punishing her, Sarah. I just couldn't let her keep pretending." "And what about you?" Sarah asked. "What's next for you?" Ben exhaled slowly, his gaze distant. "I don't know yet. But for the first time in a long time, I feel free. Maybe that's enough for now." As the night deepened, Ben allowed himself a moment of quiet relief. The truth was out, and though the road ahead would be uncertain, he knew he had taken the first step toward reclaiming his life. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, awkward conversations, and quiet reflection. Ben had moved out of the home he had once poured his soul into, leaving behind the reminders of a life that no longer felt real. For now, Sarah's spare room became his sanctuary, a temporary refuge as he figured out his next steps. Despite the upheaval, Ben found solace in small, unexpected moments. Mornings with Sarah over a shared pot of coffee became grounding rituals. Her quiet support was unwavering, her encouragement a reminder that not all relationships were built on deceit. She gave him space when he needed it and listened when he wanted to talk. On the third morning, as the light filtered through the curtains, Sarah leaned across the table. "What's your plan now?" she asked gently. Ben hesitated, the question settling heavily. "I'm not sure yet," he admitted. "Everything feels so open. For the first time in years, I don't have a set path." "That's not a bad thing," Sarah said, her smile soft. "It's a chance to build something new, on your terms." Her words stayed with him as he began taking steps to rebuild. He contacted a lawyer to start the divorce proceedings. The process was painful, a stark acknowledgement of the life he was leaving behind, but it also felt necessary, a way to reclaim his dignity and assert control over his future. One afternoon, as he packed the last of his belongings from the house, Emma appeared. She looked fragile, her once confident demeanor replaced with a hollow sadness. "Ben," she began, her voice trembling. "I know I don't deserve it, but I need to say this. I'm sorry. I was selfish, and I hurt you in ways I can't undo." Ben stood silently for a moment, the weight of her apology settling between them. "You're right," he said finally. "You were selfish. You destroyed something I thought was unbreakable. But I accept your apology, not for you, but for me." Emma's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, her shoulders slumping. "I understand. I hope you find happiness. You deserve it." Ben didn't respond. He simply turned back to the box he was packing, signaling the end of the conversation. Her apology, though genuine, couldn't mend what had been broken. In the weeks that followed, Ben began to find a rhythm. He threw himself into work, picking up extra shifts to fill the quiet hours. But it wasn't all about distraction. He also began exploring hobbies he had long neglected. His evenings were spent sketching plans for a woodworking project he'd always wanted to try. The act of creating something tangible with his hands became a source of therapy, a reminder of his own resilience. Through Sarah's encouragement, he also reconnected with old friends. One weekend, she dragged him to a local barbecue, where familiar faces welcomed him with open arms. For the first time in months, Ben laughed freely, the weight on his chest lifting just a little more. One of those friends, Mike, had recently opened a contracting business and offered Ben a chance to partner with him. The idea intrigued Ben. It was something new, something he could shape on his own terms. He spent days mulling it over, weighing the risks and rewards. In the end, it felt right. The partnership would give him a fresh start, both professionally and personally. On a quiet Sunday morning, Ben found himself standing at a park overlooking a lake. The water was calm, the early light reflecting off its surface. In his hands, he held a small wooden box, his first completed project from the workshop he'd set up in Sarah's garage. Inside were mementos of his old life, a photograph from his wedding day, a dried flower Emma had once tucked into a book, and a copy of the vows they had written together. One by one, he placed the items into the lake. The box floated briefly before tipping, the contents sinking into the depths. Ben watched them disappear, a catharsis washing over him. It wasn't about erasing the past but letting go of the weight it held. As he turned to leave, his phone buzzed. It was Sarah, sending a picture of a listing for a small, fixer-upper cabin outside of town. Her text read, "It's not much, but I think it could be something amazing. Just like you." Ben smiled, the first genuine, unburdened smile in weeks. He looked back at the lake one last time before heading to his truck. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel daunting. It felt like a chance to begin again.